If you're listening to this right now, you're either about to fall asleep, or you're about to learn how your government once tried to mind control pigeons, prostitutes, and possibly your grandparents. Welcome to Sleepy Dreamer in America. Tonight's bedtime story is about spies on acid, scientists with too much funding, and a secret program that tried to unlock the human mind, and mostly found the floor instead. This is the story of MK Ultra, the CIA's experiment in controlling thoughts, bending wills, and maybe, if they got lucky, building the perfect spy who could resist communism and a bad trip. So get comfortable, close your eyes, and let's drift back to a time when America believed LSD might be the key to winning the Cold War, or at least to making someone confess where they hid the microfilm. It's the early 1950s. The Cold War is young and dramatic, like a teenager with nuclear weapons. The United States is obsessed with one question: what if the Soviets can control people's minds? You see, the Korean War had just ended, and some captured American soldiers came back saying strange things, that they had been brainwashed. The words sounded terrifying, and also a little bit like something you might see advertised at a laundromat. Washington panicked, because if the communists could brainwash soldiers, maybe they could brainwash presidents. And if they could brainwash presidents, then, well, there goes democracy. So naturally, the CIA decided to do the most logical thing possible. They set out to beat the Soviets at brainwashing by doing their own brainwashing. It was like hearing your neighbor has a flamethrower and deciding the only way to stay safe is to build a bigger one inside your kitchen. Enter the Central Intelligence Agency, new, shiny, and very excited to play with science it didn't quite understand. The man running the show was Allen Dulles, the CIA's director, and a big believer that communists were basically hypnotizing everyone with psychological trickery. To fight that, he approved a research project called MK Ultra, a secret operation to explore chemical interrogation, psychological conditioning, and behavioral modification. If you translate that from spy speak, it basically means, let's see if we can make people tell the truth by giving them drugs. And not just any drugs. Oh no. They wanted something that could dissolve a person's sense of self, like truth, serum with a kick. And in their search for the perfect chemical weapon, they stumbled on something brand new. LSD, or lysergic acid diethylamide, had been discovered a few years earlier by a Swiss chemist named Albert Hofmann, who accidentally absorbed some through his fingers and went on the world's first acid trip and on a bicycle. Imagine discovering an entirely new reality, and your only form of transportation is a bike. That's dedication. Word of this strange chemical reached the CIA through their network of scientific informants. They were fascinated. A few drops of this colorless liquid could make a person see music, taste time, and forget what shoes are. To them, that sounded promising. So they bought all of it, literally. The CIA became one of the biggest purchasers of LSD in the world, not for parties, but for patriotism. They figured if they could learn how LSD messed with people's minds, they could weaponize it. Maybe spray it over enemy camps to make soldiers drop their guns and start philosophizing. Or dose enemy diplomats so they'd confess their secrets between waves of cosmic laughter. It sounds ridiculous now, but at the time, it was cutting-edge Cold War logic. If LSD could make you question reality, maybe it could make you question your loyalty. The man who took this theory and ran with it, barefoot through a field of questionable ethics, was Dr. Sidney Gottlieb. Gottlieb was a chemist, soft-spoken, and known around CIA headquarters as the Black Sorcerer. He was part scientist, part mystic, and he believed LSD could unlock the human mind. He also had a goat farm, because of course he did. Under his direction, MK Ultra expanded into a sprawling network of experiments, secret labs, fake front organizations, and university studies with funding that always came from somewhere mysterious and labeled research grant. Most people who participated didn't even know they were part of a CIA project. They just thought they were signing up for some fun psychology experiments. Spoiler, they weren't. At first, the tests were small and contained. Scientists would give each other LSD and note the results. It was like a really nerdy version of a college rave. But soon, Gottlieb wanted more. He wanted to know what would happen if someone took LSD without expecting it, without the comfort of a lab coat or a clipboard. And that's where things started to get ethically flexible. The CIA began dosing people without their consent. Agents would slip LSD into coffee cups, martinis, morning orange juice, all in the name of science. One agent reportedly spiked his boss's drink during a meeting just to see what would happen. What happened was paranoia, confusion, and probably the most awkward office party in history. They even had a program called Operation Midnight Climax. Yes, that's the real name, where they set up safe houses in San Francisco and New York, hired sex workers to lure men in, and then secretly dosed them with LSD while CIA agents watched from behind two-way mirrors. It was part science, part spy, novel part deeply uncomfortable Airbnb review. As the experiments expanded, so did the paranoia. The CIA started to worry that they were being spied on by themselves. Gottlieb's team operated in such secrecy that even other branches of the CIA didn't know what was happening, and that secrecy was perfect for chaos. Files were mislabeled, doses were miscalculated. Scientists began taking LSD recreationally, sometimes while on duty. For a brief shining moment, parts of the CIA were tripping. Imagine the agency tasked with protecting national security spending half a day trying to figure out if the wall was breathing. That's not satire, that's K-Ultra. But behind the bizarre humor of it all was a darker truth. Some subjects weren't volunteers. Prisoners, hospital patients, and people in psychiatric institutions were given LSD without consent, some repeatedly. The goal was to study how long-term exposure could break down resistance to interrogation. What it actually did was traumatize people, sometimes permanently. One Army scientist, Frank Olson, was dosed without his knowledge at a CIA retreat. He had a terrifying reaction, intense paranoia, confusion, and days later fell from a hotel window in New York City. The CIA called it suicide, but years later, Olson's family and a number of investigators suspected otherwise. His death became one of the first public hints that something deeply strange was happening inside the intelligence world. And yet, the program went on. By the late 1950s, MKUltra had grown into a maze of at least 150 sub-projects: hypnosis, sensory deprivation, radiation, electroshock. You name it, they tried it. And at the center of it all was this belief that the mind could be reprogrammed. To the CIA, the human brain was just another Cold War battlefield. If they could figure out how to control thoughts, they could control truth itself. But instead, what they found over and over was chaos. LSD didn't make people easier to control. It made them unpredictable, poetic, and occasionally convinced they were melting into the carpet, not ideal qualities in a spy. Still, for a time, MKUltra thrived in secrecy, its results messy, its morals questionable, and its paperwork conveniently always classified. But the truth, as always, was preparing to leak. And that's where we'll leave this first chapter. We've met the dreamers, the chemists, and the government's most ambitious science project gone wrong. In part 2, we'll drift deeper into the maze, where LSD experiments leave the lab and spill into American universities, hospitals, and the streets, shaping not just intelligence history, but the entire counterculture that followed. Because sometimes, even the darkest government secret can accidentally start a movement. By the mid-1950s, MKUltra was running full steam, if you can call erratic LSD-fueled confusion steam. Dr. Sidney Gottlieb and his crew had done what few scientists could ever claim. They made the CIA trip harder than anyone else in history. But the problem with mind-altering substances is they don't like to stay contained. LSD was slippery, both chemically and socially. It was about to leak out of the lab, spill over government fences, and roll right into the heart of American culture like a tie-dyed bowling ball. To understand how that happened, we need to talk about the CIA's secret web of front organizations. When the agency wanted to test LSD outside its own walls, it didn't exactly walk into universities and say, "Hi, we're here to melt some minds." Instead, it hid behind fake research foundations, impressive-sounding names like the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology. That one sounds almost wholesome, like it should be studying plants or dolphins. In reality, it was studying how to dissolve someone's sense of self. The CIA funneled money through these shell groups to universities, hospitals, and private researchers, often without the scientists knowing who their true funder was. All they got was a generous grant, a mysterious brief, and a promise that their findings were of national importance. If you were a psychologist in 1956 and someone offered you money to study LSD's effects on human consciousness, you didn't ask too many questions. You just bought a lot of coffee and started taking notes. One of those scientists was a young man named Harold Abramson, an allergist, yes, an allergist, who somehow became one of the CIA's key LSD researchers. Abramson had a private practice in New York and a curious mind. The CIA gave him funds through a front organization, and he began dosing volunteers, patients, and sometimes even himself. His reports were fascinating if you ignored the ethical horror of it all. People described cosmic visions, deep introspection, and occasionally the urge to talk to furniture. Abramson sent glowing letters to Gottlieb. LSD could open doors in the mind, he said. The CIA, of course, was more interested in locking those doors from the outside. Another major hub of research was Stanford University, where psychiatrist Dr. James Fadiman and others were studying LSD's effects on creativity. Now, these weren't CIA scientists directly, but their funding had roots that traced back to MK Ultra's hidden purse strings. Artists, engineers, and writers volunteered for these creativity sessions. They'd take LSD, sit quietly, and then attempt to solve problems or create art. The results were astonishing. Some claimed their creative blocks vanished, others saw the meaning of life, and then forgot it 10 minutes later. What the CIA didn't expect was that some of these test subjects would become evangelists. They didn't see LSD as a weapon. They saw it as a revelation. And they started talking. The most famous of them all was a Harvard psychology lecturer named Timothy Leary. He didn't start in MK Ultra, but he was indirectly influenced by its experiments, since many of the early batches of LSD circulating in the US had been synthesized under CIA contracts. Leary tried LSD for the first time in 1960 and decided it was the future of human evolution. He left academia and began preaching a psychedelic gospel. Turn on, tune in, drop out. Ironically, the very drug the CIA had hoped to use to control people became the drug that made millions of Americans question authority itself. It's almost poetic. The ultimate government backfire. But while the counterculture was being born, in university dorms and California communes, MK Ultra was still quietly operating in the shadows, running tests that made Woodstock look tame. The agency had dozens of sub-projects. One studied hypnosis and LSD combined, because apparently, just one form of mind alteration wasn't enough. Another tested drugs on prisoners in exchange for shorter sentences, a deal that was, at best, morally questionable, and at worst, coercive. At the federal prison in Lexington, Kentucky, for example, researchers gave LSD to inmates recovering from addiction. Some were dosed daily for weeks. The goal? To see how much it took to break a person's sense of reality. Spoiler, not that much. Back at CIA headquarters, Sidney Gottlieb's reports were becoming harder to interpret, partly because the data was unreliable, and partly because half the researchers were still high. LSD wasn't producing the clear, consistent results the agency had hoped for. One subject might start singing nursery rhymes, another might become convinced they were a cloud. As a tool for interrogation, LSD was a disaster. But as a tool for existential crisis, it was unmatched. And yet the CIA kept at it. Why? Because in the 1950s, giving up was not an intelligence option. If a project didn't work, the solution was to double it. Meanwhile, outside the government, LSD's legend was growing. Writers like Aldous Huxley, who had tried mescaline and later experimented with LSD, were publishing works like The Doors of Perception, describing psychedelic experiences as gateways to the divine. Musicians, poets, and dreamers were curious, and thanks to the leaks from these early experiments, the drug began to circulate through underground channels. By the early 1960s, America had two parallel LSD stories. One secret, hidden behind government files stamped top secret, and one public, painted in neon and accompanied by sitars. Both were searching for the same thing: control of the mind, whether by science or by self-discovery. And here's where things get even stranger. The CIA, in its infinite irony, helped fund the same wave of psychedelic research that later fueled anti-establishment movements. Many of the LSD samples distributed to early experimenters came from laboratories under MKUltra's umbrella. So when people in San Francisco or Harvard were expanding their minds, some of them were, unknowingly, expanding the CIA's purchase history. Imagine trying to suppress a social revolution that you accidentally paid for. By 1963, the CIA began to lose interest. The results were too inconsistent, the methods too chaotic, and public attention toward LSD was starting to grow. Gottlieb started to realize that the experiment was spiraling, not just scientifically, but culturally. T.S. Genie was out of the bottle, and it was wearing round sunglasses and listening to The Grateful Dead. As LSD spread across America, it began to reshape art, music, and spirituality. The same chemical that the CIA once imagined as a truth serum became the fuel for the summer of love. What began in sterile government labs had spilled into the parks of San Francisco, where teenagers lay on blankets, staring at clouds and declaring peace on Earth. If MKUltra had a mission to control people's minds, it failed spectacularly. But if it had a secret side mission to change how Americans thought about reality, well, that one succeeded by accident. By the mid-1960s, LSD was everywhere. And so were questions, whispers about secret experiments, mysterious funding, and scientists who'd vanished into secrecy. Some journalists began poking around. Congressmen started hearing rumors. And within the CIA itself, a quiet sense of unease began to grow, because they knew, if anyone ever found out the full story about the drugging of civilians, the secret experiments, the deaths, the public, outrage would be unstoppable. So they did what any self-respecting spy agency would do. They started shredding. As the 1960s burned bright with color and chaos, the last pages of MKUltra were being quietly torn up in hidden offices. But paper, like memory, has a way of surviving. And when the truth finally surfaced, years later, it would shake the American public to its core, revealing not just a strange Cold War experiment, but a story about the limits of control and the dangerous curiosity of men who thought they could play with minds. In Part 3, we'll uncover how MKUltra began to crumble, how the scandal finally broke open, and how the CIA's psychedelic secret was exposed to the world. Because even the best-kept secrets have a half-life, and this one was radioactive with regret. The thing about secrets is, they always seem to have expiration dates. You can bury the truth, shred the paper, even pretend it never happened. But somewhere, someone always remembers a detail. By the early 1970s, the CIA had almost managed to erase MKUltra from history. Almost files were destroyed, scientists were reassigned, and Sidney Gottlieb, the man who once dosed half of Washington, had quietly retired to his goat farm, making yogurt and practicing meditation. Perhaps the most ironic postscript imaginable, but even a goat farm can't hide a ghost that big, because America was changing. The Vietnam War had bred distrust in government, the Pentagon Papers had cracked the facade of secrecy, and suddenly, the American public was beginning to wonder what else their government might have been hiding. The answer, as it turned out, was a lot of LSD. The first real crack came from a tragedy long forgotten: the death of Frank Olson, the Army scientist who'd fallen from a New York hotel window back in 1953. For decades, his death had been written off as suicide. But in the early 1970s, new documents began to surface. They hinted that Olson had been dosed with LSD without his knowledge during a CIA retreat, and that afterward, he'd expressed regret and paranoia about the agency's activities. Then, he died. Conveniently, his family never believed the suicide story. They'd been told conflicting details for years, and in 1975 they decided to push for answers. They weren't alone. Because by coincidence, or fate, this was the same year the United States government was about to start cleaning house. In the wake of Watergate, President Gerald Ford had a bit of a problem. The American public didn't trust its intelligence agencies. And to be fair, the agencies had given them a lot of reasons not to. So Ford created the Rockefeller Commission, a panel tasked with investigating the CIA's domestic activities. You know, just to make sure everything was above board. Spoiler, it wasn't. The commission expected to find a few embarrassing secrets. What they found instead was a vault of nightmares, code names, destroyed files, and whispers of experiments that sounded more like science fiction than statecraft. When they asked the CIA about unusual drug testing, the agency's representatives hesitated. Then slowly, reluctantly, they started talking. They described behavioral modification programs, chemical interrogation, sub-projects, and somewhere among the acronyms and euphemisms a name emerged: MK Ultra. It sounded like a bad comic book villain, but the details were very real. The CIA admitted it had conducted drug experiments on unwitting individuals, including U.S. citizens. They admitted to using LSD, and they admitted that one of their employees, Frank Olson, had died as a result. America, understandably, lost its collective mind. Newspapers ran stories with headlines like, "CIA secretly dosed Americans with LSD." TV anchors spoke of mind control experiments. And for the first time, the phrase MK Ultra entered public consciousness, a kind of bureaucratic boogeyman. It was shocking, it was absurd. And it was absolutely true. The Senate soon launched its own investigation. The Church Committee, named after Senator Frank Church, who seemed determined to open every dusty CIA closet and see what skeletons fell out. The hearings became a national spectacle. Americans who had grown up trusting their government now sat in front of their televisions, watching senators ask about hypnosis, LSD, and psychic warfare, as if the Cold War had taken a hard left into the Twilight Zone. Witnesses described experiments on soldiers, prisoners, and civilians. They spoke of scientists dosing one another, of CIA-funded brothels, of secret safe houses equipped with two-way mirrors. The senators were aghast. At one point, Senator Church asked a CIA representative whether such experiments were still happening. The man hesitated. Then he said, "Not to our knowledge." Not the most reassuring phrasing. Meanwhile, the public learned something even stranger. Almost all the documentation from MK Ultra had been destroyed 2 years earlier, in 1973, by order of Sidney Gottlieb himself, just before he retired. Tens of thousands of pages gone, incinerated, erased from official record. All that remained were a few financial documents that had been misfiled in a budget office. Ironically, it was the CIA's accounting department, not its scientists, that saved the truth. Those stray receipts and memos were enough to reconstruct the outlines of MK Ultra. The funding trails, the fake foundations, the experiments, the LSD. It was like piecing together a jigsaw puzzle where half the pieces had been eaten by goats. When the truth hit the media, the response was a strange blend of outrage and disbelief. Some people couldn't accept that their government would ever do such a thing. Others weren't surprised at all. The 1970s were, after all, the age of conspiracy. The Vietnam War had eroded faith in leadership. Watergate had confirmed that even presidents lied. And now here was proof that America's most secretive agency had been dosing people with hallucinogens in the name of national security. Late-night comedians joked that the CIA had invented the hippie movement. Newspapers ran cartoons of spies, chasing tie-dye hallucinations. And behind all the jokes there was something deeply unsettling. If this had happened, what else might still be happening? President Ford personally apologized to Frank Olson's family. They received a settlement and an invitation to the White House, where Ford expressed his deep regret for what had happened. But the apology didn't close the wound. In fact, it deepened it. Years later, when Olson's body was exhumed for further investigation, forensic experts found signs that he might have been struck before falling, suggesting foul play. Whether or not the CIA was directly involved remains a mystery. But the implication was clear. MK Ultra had left more than psychological scars. It had left bodies. As the hearings continued, Sidney Gottlieb himself was called to testify. He appeared, quietly, wearing thick glasses, looking more like a kindly science teacher than the man who had orchestrated a nationwide mind control project. He defended his work as scientific exploration. He said they were trying to protect the nation from communist threats. He said he believed what they were doing was necessary. And in a way, that made it worse. Because it wasn't a story of cartoonish villains. It was a story of men who thought they were the heroes, who thought the ends justified the means. Men who believed that the human mind could be engineered like a weapon. And that belief, that arrogance, was the true experiment. By the late 1970s, MK Ultra was officially closed. The CIA promised that no similar projects would ever be allowed. Again, Congress tightened oversight of intelligence operations. New ethical guidelines were established for scientific research, but the damage was already done. To reputations, to trust, to history itself. The very idea that your government could secretly dose you with acid and call it national defense had permanently changed how Americans viewed power. The phrase mind control became part of pop culture. Books, films, and conspiracies sprouted like mushrooms. For decades to come, MK Ultra would appear in everything from documentaries to comic books, always as the shorthand for things the government probably shouldn't have done. And in fairness, that's not inaccurate. MK Ultra had started as an attempt to protect democracy. It ended up revealing one of democracy's oldest flaws, that even good intentions can go off the rails when no one's watching. It's a story about secrecy, fear, and the endless human desire to control what can't be controlled, the mind itself. But it's also a story about how truth eventually finds a way to escape. Even if it takes 20 years, even if it has to hitch a ride on a forgotten file in a dusty drawer. In Part 4, we'll drift deeper into the aftermath, how the revelations of MK Ultra changed psychology, ethics, and popular culture, and how the ghost of those experiments still lingers in America's imagination today, because the program may have ended, but the idea of mind control never really went away. When MK Ultra finally crawled into the light, it didn't end with an explosion. It ended with a sigh, a quiet sense of disbelief that something so strange, so surreal, could have been real. By 1977, the investigations were mostly done. The Senate reports were printed, the public outrage had been voiced, and the television cameras had moved on to the next scandal. But what lingered wasn't the paperwork, it was the feeling. The sense that something fundamental had shifted in how Americans dreamed about their own government. Because after MK Ultra, it wasn't possible to believe that secrecy always meant safety. It meant mystery, and sometimes madness. The story of MK Ultra wasn't just a government embarrassment. It was a national identity crisis, a hall of mirrors that reflected every fear the country had during the Cold War. Think about it. A nation obsessed with freedom had tried to master mind control. A government terrified of communist brainwashing had gone and created its own. It was like fighting fire with more fire, then wondering why everything smelled like smoke. And when those secrets came out, America had to look at itself in the mirror and admit that for a time, it had become the very thing it feared. That realization doesn't vanish easily. It seeps into culture, into art, into the collective subconscious. And from the 1970s onward, you could see MK Ultra's fingerprints everywhere, even in the dreams of people who'd never heard the name. Let's start with science, the field that MK Ultra had ironically hoped to advance. The scandal forced researchers, universities, and government institutions to rewrite their entire ethical playbook. Suddenly the phrase, informed consent, became non-negotiable. You couldn't just hand someone a pill and call it patriotism. Hospitals and labs began requiring strict oversight for experiments involving human subjects. Ethics committees were born, and every researcher who ever handed out a clipboard now had to explain, in detail, exactly what they were doing and why. In a strange way, the madness of MK Ultra became a moral compass for the rest of science. A reminder that just because you can explore the human mind doesn't mean you should. But the deeper legacy, the one that truly reshaped the American psyche, was cultural. In the decades after the scandal broke, MK Ultra became a kind of myth, not in the sense of being false, but in the sense of being bigger than truth. It was no longer just a story about LSD and scientists. It was a story about control, about how easily authority could cross the line when no one was watching. Writers, filmmakers, and musicians picked up the thread like it was a loose wire of reality. And before long, MK Ultra had woven itself into everything from pulp fiction to paranoia. You could hear its echo in the X-Files, see it in The Manchurian Candidate, feel it pulsing under songs that spoke of awakening and illusion. Every time someone said, "Don't trust the government," there was a little whisper of Gottlieb's LSD in the background, a ghostly chuckle from the goat farm. And yet, here's the strange part. While the program itself was terrifying, it also accidentally fueled something positive, a mass curiosity about consciousness. People started asking deeper questions. What is the mind? What can it do? How much of our perception is just chemistry and suggestion? The CIA had tried to crack those mysteries for control. The public, meanwhile, began exploring them for enlightenment. In a way, MK Ultra's failure gave birth to a new generation of dreamers, philosophers, and psychologists who sought to understand the mind without breaking it. Because once you know what not to do, sometimes that's the start of wisdom. Meanwhile, the LSD that once lived in classified vaults had escaped completely into the wild. By the 1980s and 90s, psychedelics were still taboo, but they'd also become legendary. The same substance that once terrified the CIA was now inspiring artists, therapists, and neuroscientists to look at human consciousness in a new light. There's a strange symmetry in that. A chemical created by accident, weaponized by fear, and eventually embraced by people seeking peace. That's not science fiction. That's just America on a loop. The pop culture version of MK Ultra became almost a genre of its own. You can trace its DNA through every mind control plot in movies and television. A mysterious government lab, MK Ultra. Secret drugs that make you see reality differently, MK Ultra. An agency experimenting on unwitting citizens, definitely MK Ultra. Even the modern world of internet conspiracy theories, with its tangled webs of shadowy organizations and secret agendas, owes part of its shape to this story. Once you learn that something this wild actually happened, every new rumor feels a little more plausible. It's not that people became paranoid. It's that they stopped finding paranoia entirely unreasonable. Still, in the middle of all the chaos and the conspiracy, there's a quieter legacy, one that rarely makes the headlines. MK Ultra also changed how we think about forgiveness, about what to do when a nation betrays its own ideals. In the years after the exposure, there were lawsuits, hearings, apologies, but you can't apologize to everyone who was affected. Some of the victims never even knew they'd been part of an experiment. Some are still unnamed in dusty case files, referred to only as Subject 9 or Patient 42. There's a kind of haunting in that, a recognition that no amount of paperwork can fix what secrecy breaks. And yet, even from that haunting came a kind of strange beauty, a new honesty about the human need to dream, to explore, to understand. MK Ultra showed us that the mind is powerful, fragile, and endlessly mysterious. That even the most advanced science can't truly own it. You can study it, distort it, even frighten it. But control it? No. The mind is the one frontier that refuses to be conquered. And maybe that's why, decades later, people still tell this story. Not just as a warning, but as a kind of lullaby. A reminder that curiosity, when unchecked by conscience, turns into madness. But curiosity, when guided by wonder, can illuminate everything. So in the end, MK Ultra wasn't just a Cold War project, it was a mirror. It showed America its reflection. Brilliant, frightened, reckless, and endlessly curious. It was a cautionary tale written in invisible ink, the kind that only shows up years later, under the right light. And if you tilt your head just right, if you listen closely enough, you can still hear it whispering through history. The mind cannot be owned. It can only be met. In Part 5, we'll drift into the modern echoes, how MK Ultra lives on in today's world, from neuroscience to Netflix, from therapy rooms to conspiracy boards. Because though the program ended, its shadow never quite left the American imagination. When a story like MK Ultra leaks into the world, it doesn't just land in the newspapers. It slips into the bloodstream of culture, into the lyrics, the colors, the half-remembered dreams of artists who never touched a government file but somehow felt what it all meant. Because MK Ultra wasn't just about LSD. It was about control, about losing yourself, and wondering if you were ever truly in charge in the first place. And that idea, that fragile, shimmering question, became catnip for creatives everywhere. Let's start with music, that most psychedelic of art, forms, the one that already blurs the edges between sound and emotion. When the MK Ultra revelations surfaced in the 1970s, musicians were already experimenting with consciousness in their own, much gentler ways. The Beatles had traveled to India, Jefferson Airplane was singing about white rabbits, and Pink Floyd had built entire galaxies out of echoes. But after the public learned that the government had been dosing people without consent, the conversation shifted. Psychedelia stopped feeling purely innocent. There was a new undertone, a ghostly reminder that every trip could have a shadow. Songs began to explore paranoia, control, and the blurry line between enlightenment and madness. David Bowie, ever the alien observer, wove that paranoia into albums like Diamond Dogs and Low. Bob Dylan hinted at unseen manipulators, tugging on the strings. Even punk, loud, sweaty, beautifully defiant, was a reaction to institutions that claimed to know what was best for everyone else's mind. MK Ultra didn't just inspire protest, it inspired a new sound. Restless, self-aware, suspicious of perfection. And maybe that's what art does best. It takes trauma, remixes it, and hands it back with a beat you can dance to. In Hollywood, MK Ultra became both subject and symbol. Filmmakers couldn't resist the image of a hidden agency bending reality. The early 1960s gave us the Manchurian Candidate, technically before MK Ultra was exposed, but spiritually right on target. A soldier brainwashed into assassination, a perfect reflection of Cold War fears wrapped in cinematic hypnosis. Then came A Clockwork Orange, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Jacob's Ladder, The Parallax View. Each film touching, in its own way, on the terror of minds being rewritten. By the time the truth about MK Ultra came out, audiences were ready. The idea that institutions might secretly be the villains wasn't shocking anymore. It was expected. And decades later, the legacy continued. The Matrix, Inception, Stranger Things, each one in its own dreamlike way, is MK Ultra's grandchild. The key theme never changes. What if the world you trust isn't the real one? What if someone somewhere has the remote control to your mind, And the answer, of course, is always the same: wake up. Writers, too, picked up the thread. From the acid-drenched prose of Hunter S. Thompson to the haunting realism of Joan Didion, everyone was wrestling with the same question. How do you tell truth in a world that keeps distorting it? MK Ultra became a symbol for that tension, the literary ghost of the 20th century. It crept into novels like Gravity's Rainbow by Thomas Pynchon and Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace, sprawling labyrinths of irony, paranoia, and dark humor. You can even feel it in the cyberpunk worlds of William Gibson, where technology replaces LSD as the new tool for mental manipulation. The government becomes the algorithm. The drug becomes the data stream. In a sense, MK Ultra evolved into a metaphor for information overload. No one needs LSD anymore. We're all microdosing on the internet. Visual artists, especially in the post-war and psychedelic movements, were fascinated by altered perception. But MK Ultra gave that fascination a darker edge. You can see it in the surrealist explosions of color in the 1960s posters. Swirling, fractal, hypnotic, almost defiant. Every pattern seemed to say, if you're going to mess with my mind, at least make it beautiful. Even today, the influence lingers in digital art, with its glitch aesthetics and dreamlike distortions. The glitch itself, that accidental, broken flicker, is a modern symbol of what MK Ultra tried to do: interrupt reality and reprogram the signal. Except now, artists embrace the glitch. They make it intentional. They turn distortion into design. Maybe that's the ultimate poetic revenge, taking the language of control and rewriting it as freedom. When you zoom out, MK Ultra becomes less a historical scandal and more a kind of cultural archetype. A modern myth about knowledge gone too far. Every society has its forbidden story. The apple in Eden, Prometheus stealing fire, Frankenstein's spark. MK Ultra is America's version of that. The tale of curiosity outrunning conscience. It's the dream that says, we wanted to understand the soul, and instead we found the circuitry of fear. But the remarkable thing is how art softened that. Instead of letting the fear fester, artists turned it into imagination. Instead of mind control, they created mind expansion. The nation that once tried to control consciousness ended up creating entire genres devoted to exploring it. It's as if MK Ultra planted a seed of paranoia, and what grew was creativity. Strange, dazzling, endlessly self-aware. In the end, art and imagination did what science and secrecy could not. They gave people a way to process the unthinkable. A painting can forgive what history can't. A song can make sense of the absurd. And a story, told gently, perhaps even sleepily, can turn a national nightmare into something strangely human. MK Ultra reminds us that the line between control and creativity is razor thin. Both begin with curiosity, both play with perception, but only one ends with music, color, and laughter. And maybe that's why the story still lingers. Not as terror, but as texture, a little dissonant note in America's lullaby. So if you ever catch yourself staring at a painting that seems to move, or hearing a lyric that feels like it's singing directly to your subconscious, maybe that's just MK Ultra's ghost, humming softly in the background, not to control you, just to remind you that the human mind, once expanded by wonder, never truly shrinks back. In Part 7, we'll wander toward the twilight, the lessons, the apologies, and the strange comfort that came after the storm. Because every dream, even a bad one, eventually wakes into something wiser. There's a point, after every great madness, when people start asking the same question. What did we learn from all this? It's the morning after question, the hangover of history. And MK Ultra left a particularly strange one. Because what do you learn from trying to read the human mind and realizing it's written in a language you can't control? Maybe the first lesson was this: curiosity without conscience isn't intelligence. It's just cleverness with better stationery. For all its ambition, MK Ultra ultimately proved something that mystics and poets already knew. The mind is not a machine you can rewire. It's a garden you can tend. You can influence it, nurture it, maybe even prune it. But if you try to dominate it, it simply grows wild in another direction. The CIA thought they were discovering science. In truth, they were stumbling into philosophy. Every time a subject forgot their name or hallucinated new realities, the agency wasn't getting closer to control. It was drifting further into the mystery of what consciousness actually is, and that, oddly enough, may be the most important scientific result they ever produced. In the wake of MK Ultra, America was forced to ask hard questions about power and morality. How much secrecy can democracy survive? How far can science go before it loses its soul? The aftermath sparked a wave of ethical reforms. The Belmont Report, institutional review boards, the birth of bioethics as a serious field. We started talking about things like consent, autonomy, and the dignity of the human subject. Words that sound boring until you realize how revolutionary they are. Because behind each one is a quiet promise. Never again will we treat a person's mind as property. Of course, promises are easy. Counting them is harder, but at least the conversation began. And maybe that's what progress really looks like. Not a miracle, but a meeting. The second lesson was harder. It was about trust. After MK Ultra, faith in government intelligence took a nosedive. The very agencies meant to protect the nation had turned inward, experimenting on their own citizens. That revelation didn't just scar individuals. It scarred a generation. It became the background hum of American skepticism, the reason every new official statement is met with an eyebrow raised ever so slightly higher. But distrust, like radiation, has a half-life. And with time, something curious happened. People began to realize that skepticism can also be a kind of wisdom. Not cynicism, not despair. Just the quiet recognition that power, unexamined, will always drift toward secrecy. And secrecy, left unchecked, will always drift toward abuse. It's not a comforting thought, but it's an honest one, and maybe honesty is the best insomnia cure of all. The third lesson is about memory, not just personal, but collective. Most of MK Ultra's files were destroyed before the investigations began. What we know today comes from fragments, misfiled invoices, stray letters, and the occasional confession whispered decades too late. In a way, MK Ultra is a story made of negative space. It's defined by what's missing, and that absence has a strange kind of poetry, because it forces us to fill in the blanks, to imagine, to remember, to dream. History, after all, is a kind of collective hallucination. We build meaning out of fragments. We tell ourselves stories until the silence starts to make sense. Maybe that's why this one keeps returning, because it's unfinished. It's a national dream we keep revising in our sleep. The fourth lesson? That control is an illusion. And chaos isn't the enemy we think it is. MK Ultra tried to impose order on something inherently fluid, consciousness. It's like trying to pin a shadow to the wall with a thumbtack. But maybe chaos, that unpredictable dance of thought, memory, and emotion is what keeps us human. It's what makes art, love, forgiveness, and even laughter possible. If the CIA had succeeded, if they'd truly mastered the mind, we might have lost the very thing that makes the mind worth studying in the first place. Sometimes failure is the only moral success available. Decades later, MK Ultra feels both distant and intimate. Distant enough to seem unreal, but close enough to live in our language. Whenever we say things like, "Don't drink the Kool-Aid," or "red pill, blue pill," we're echoing the residue of those years. Metaphors born from mistrust, now woven into everyday speech. Time didn't erase the story. It just smoothed its edges, turned terror into trivia, then trivia into folklore. That's how civilizations heal. They turn their nightmares into bedtime stories so they can finally sleep. So what remains? A handful of names, some surviving files, and a lesson that refuses to fade. That the pursuit of control, whether through science, politics, or persuasion, always leads back to the same paradox. The more you try to own the mind, the less you understand it. Maybe the trick isn't control at all. Maybe it's compassion, because the mind, for all its mystery, responds not to dominance but to kindness, a steady voice, a moment of safety, a story told just softly enough to let the listener drift. Perhaps that's the true anti-MK Ultra. The gentle act of helping someone let go instead of forcing them to hold on. So as the 20th century turned and the secret files gathered dust, America learned to live with its reflection. Imperfect, fascinating, flawed. It learned that the mind cannot be caged, but it can be guided toward peace. And sometimes the best form of control is none at all. In Part 8, we'll close the circle, returning to the dream itself. We'll drift back through the echoes of MK Ultra and end where all good midnight stories do, in the space between forgetting and forgiveness. If you've made it this far, congratulations. You've drifted through one of the strangest stories in American history, a story so bizarre it almost feels fictional, and yet every page was signed, stamped, and filed under top secret, the CIA's LSD experiments, America's secret mind control program. A dream born of fear, written in acid and ended in disbelief. But like all dreams, it wasn't about what it seemed. It was about us, the dreamers. In the 1950s, America dreamed of control, of order, victory, clean lawns, and tidy minds. It was the age of conformity dressed as comfort, of perfect smiles hiding atomic anxiety. And into that dream came the whisper, what if they can read our thoughts? What if they can change them? Fear of communism became fear of consciousness. So the government, in its infinite irony, tried to fight nightmares with more nightmares. They created MK Ultra, the scientific version of a bad dream, and the ICE nation never quite woke up the same. There's something deeply haunting and deeply human about the people who lived through it. The test subjects, the unwitting patients, the agents who thought they were serving progress, they were all dreamers in their own way. Each of them thought they understood reality, until someone tilted the axis just enough to make everything strange. One moment, you're a hospital patient. The next, you're a line in a classified experiment. One moment, you're a scientist chasing truth. The next, you're realizing the truth doesn't want to be caught. It's hard not to feel compassion for all of them, even the ones who caused the harm. Because to study the mind and not lose your own, that's no small miracle. Governments don't apologize well. There's no ceremony for remorse, no medal for regret. And yet, in quiet ways, the country did acknowledge what happened. Hearings were held, policies were changed. Letters of compensation were mailed decades too late, sometimes to families who didn't even know they were owed. But apologies are for the living, and MK Ultra's deepest wounds belong to memory. You can't write a check to a lost sense of reality. You can't file closure in triplicate. All you can do is remember, and hope remembering is enough. Even now, the story hums under our daily lives. Every movie about hidden agendas, every meme about red pills and reality distortion, every quiet doubt when someone says, "Trust us." It's the echo of a truth we don't quite want to believe, that human beings are capable of anything, when fear wears the mask of science. But there's another echo, softer, hidden beneath the first. It's the sound of laughter, of artists, musicians, and dreamers taking the fear and turning it into beauty. MK Ultra may have tried to weaponize the mind, but the mind, clever as ever, turned itself into art instead. That's the quiet rebellion. That's how the story redeems itself. If MK Ultra taught anything, it's that control is the opposite of understanding. To know the mind, you have to listen, not conquer. Maybe that's why you're here, listening to this story in the dark. Because stories are the gentlest kind of hypnosis. They ask nothing of you but attention, and they return you to yourself a little calmer than before. You've been following a trail of secrets and science, of experiments and errors. But maybe the real journey was inward. To remember that your thoughts, your memories, your dreams are yours. Not the government's, not anyone else's. Just yours, tender, messy, unrepeatable. And if someone ever tried to map or control them, they'd fail. Because the mind, like a dream, belongs to no one but the dreamer. So here we are. The lights are low. The story is nearly over, and America's strangest experiment fades into silence. Maybe it was madness. Maybe it was a warning. Maybe it was just what happens when a superpower takes too many caffeine pills and forgets to meditate. Whatever it was, it reminds us that even in our worst attempts to control the unknown, we're still explorers. Fumbling, curious, occasionally ridiculous, but always reaching for understanding. And that reaching, that curiosity, that's what keeps us human. So, take a deep breath. Let the story settle somewhere in the back of your mind, not as fear, but as wonder. The dream has ended. The experiments are over. The files are dust. And here, in the quiet after, there's only you and your thoughts dancing freely, unmeasured, unowned. You've just listened to Sleepy Dreamer in America, where history gets a little weird and you get a little sleepier. Good night, dreamer. And remember, your mind is the only country that no one else can ever invade.